In this video, I will talk about malware. The material from in this lecture comes from a course at Stanford and a few additions by me. Okay, so we will look at what malware is, how malware infects hosts, how to detect malware, and then the new case of mobile malware. So very basically, malware is a set of instructions that will run on your computer and make your computer do something that an attacker wants it to do. Now, what is malware good for? Malware is good for stealing personal information, deleting files, doing click fraud, stealing software serial numbers, or using your computer as a relay, for example, in a botnet, or even holding users to ransom. Now, what classes of malware exist? We have viruses, backdoors, Trojans or Trojan horses, rootkits, scareware, adware, worms, and more recently we've had the case of ransomware. Ransomware is software that will encrypt your files and basically hold those files ransom. If the user doesn't pay over a certain amount of money in a certain amount of time, then that data is lost for good. What is a virus? A virus is a program that can infect other programs by modifying them to include a possibly evolved version of itself. Now, viruses can be polymorphic or metamorphic. Polymorphic viruses will use a polymorphic engine to mutate or change while keeping the original algorithm intact. Metamorphic viruses, on the other hand, change their form after each infection. And what about backdoors? Backdoors are simply entry points to a program or a system that is hidden or disguised. Very often, these backdoors are created by the software's author for maintenance. And if this sequence of characters becomes known, then the software becomes vulnerable. Okay? Next, we'll talk about Trojans or Trojan horses. So a Trojan will describe malware that seems to perform a desirable function, but in fact, it will perform some malicious functions that will then allow some malicious user, access, an unauthorized access to the computer. Now, rootkits, on the other hand, are components that will use stealth to maintain some persistent and undetectable presence on a machine. Now, rootkits are similar to hack tools, basically, and once an intruder can use a rootkit to have administrator level access to a computer. Generally speaking, rootkits are difficult to detect. Now, scareware, on the other hand, is software that preys upon our fears to make us take some action that can compromise our own security. This definition comes from Symantec. And adware would be programs that secretly gather some personal information through the internet and then relay it to some other computer. Typically, this is done by tracking browsing habits, and generally it's done for advertising. And then a worm is a self-replicating computer program, and it will use a network to send copies of itself to other nodes, and it would typically do so without any user intervention. One of the first worms is actually the Morris worm in 1988, and written by this guy Robert Morris, and that was one of the very, very early forms of malware. Okay, now let's look a little bit at how malware infects hosts. So malware can infect either the executable or an interpreted file, your kernel, or some service, or the master boot record, or the hypervisor. When the executable is infected, the executable may be overwritten with malware, or the malware can be prepended into the executable or appended at the end, or it could even be inserted amongst the bytes of your executable. Um, the malware can, um, when we have interpreted files in, the malware can be put into some auto start file or a macro or even within a document. That's one of the vectors used now for passing around ransomware, basically interpreted files. In the case where the kernel is infected, the kernel can be infected via a kernel patch or a loadable kernel module, or even from kernel memory patching. And then the master boot record, if that is infected, then you can bypass all the protections of the operating system, because the operating system assumes that the system on which it was running was in a trusted state at the time that the operating system bootloader took over. So um, if your master boot record is infected, then it's very hard to even catch these kinds of infections. Now, how do we detect these infections? The easiest way to detect them is by using an antivirus. And an antivirus system will analyze the system's behavior and then analyze the binary maybe to decide if it is a virus. And there are two different types. There are scanners and real-time monitors. And I should point out that it is well known from computer science theory that it's impossible to build a perfect virus malware or virus or malware detector. This is known as the impossibility result. So viruses have signatures. This signature is simply a string that can identify the virus. Okay, and this signature is like a fingerprint. Another way you can analyze, identify malware is by using heuristics. You simply analyze the program's behavior, how it accesses the network, what files it opens, you know, if it attempts to delete files or attempts to modify the boot sector. Another option is to compute a checksum. Okay, so you compute a checksum for a good binary file or for some configuration file, and then you detect a change by comparing this checksum to the checksum that you compute over some file. Okay, and typically, this is good for catching some malware, but we can have a problem where you might have more malware than goodware. Okay, another thing you can do is with sandbox analysis. In this case, you run the executable inside a virtual machine. You observe it, observe its file activity, how it uses the network, how it uses the memory. And this can give you some indication as to what kind of malware you're dealing with. And then with worms, you can detect worms by using honey farms. Honey farms are simply collections of honeypots. Okay, um, and you can then look at any outbound connection from your honey farm. Then will be a worm. At least that's the theory. And you can then form a signature by looking at the inbound and outbound traffic. And typically, if your telescope that you use, right, for your honey farm covers about n IP addresses, then you can expect to detect a worm when the worm has infected, 1/nth of the population of your honey farm. Now, to thwart worms, we're going to use scan suppressors. These are basically network elements that will block traffic from hosts that make failed connection attempts to too many other hosts. So it can take 5 minutes to several weeks to write the signature, and then several hours or more to test this. Now, this process takes too long right now, and in fact, current um, worm threats can spread a lot faster than defenses can react. So finally, let's look at mobile malware. Mobile malware is becoming a lot more common as we have, lots of Android phones and lots of iPhones, right? So how do we attack mobiles? Well, you can attack via web browsers or via the installed applications. And so with mobile malware, there are certain things that we can do. You might send premium SMS messages. In some jurisdictions, for example, messages may be sent to, say, a 900 number in the US. Um, you have an extra charge that you pay for that. And so someone can install malware and then have you make send lots of messages to these premium numbers, and they get money from that. Or they might steal your location, or the malware can record phone calls or log SMSs. Okay. And in general, mobile malware is similar to desktop or malware for desktops or PCs. You can connect to a bot master. You can steal data. You can be involved in phishing or bad advertising. Um, and what kinds of goals do malware authors have? Well, they might want to get money immediately. Okay, so they might abuse some premium service, so sending the premium SMS, as I mentioned earlier, or display ads, or steal your information, or performing click fraud. Um, and typically, another option they might want to have is um, to control your machine remotely, or to have some kind of root exploit. So just to summarize, malware is a set of instructions that is designed to run on your system to do something that the attacker wants. And there are multiple types of malware. And the goals of malware include stealing your data or enrollment in a botnet. And remember, we use these botnets then to carry out denial of service attacks. And malware can be identified by analyzing your program operation, for example, by running it from a sandbox or by creating a honey farm. This brings an end this video.